Welcome to the next unit of F360, Indiana Folklore and Folk Life. In this unit, we'll explore quilt making in northeastern Indiana and use this genre of a traditional craft to explore the history, design, and aesthetics of this region. No story of Indiana quilts could be told without mentioning the work of Marie Webster. At a time when quilt patterns were usually shared between family and friends, Webster, a Hoosier native, began circulating her patterns nationally through the Ladies' Home Journal. In 1915, she published Quilts, Their Stories and How to Make Them, the first major book of American quilt history. As a successful entrepreneur, she established the Practical Patchwork Company, a mail-order business that sold applique quilt patterns of her own design. Influenced by the arts and craft aesthetic of the day, many of Marie's quilts employed floral designs, which provided an alternative to the square block patterns in wide use across the Midwest. Her works were not wholly new, though. In fact, her color palette and applique techniques were inspired by Indiana quilts from the mid-19th century. For example, this Pots of Flowers quilt, or perhaps this Turkey Track quilt, both made in Indiana in the 1850s. You can see the solid, bold colors in the applique techniques. Not only was her work inspired by earlier generations, it was also inspired by the quilting traditions of the Amish in northeastern Indiana. As seen in this daisy quilt, the pattern was designed by Marie Webster and was first published in 1912. The use of solid colors and the incorporation of bars into the design of the quilt had been a staple of Amish communities since they brought it to the state from Pennsylvania and Ohio in the 1840s. As we've noted in other classes, Indiana is home to several Amish and Mennonite communities, which has significantly influenced quilt making in our state. The quilts tend to fall into two categories. Applique quilts, like this variation on a princess feather pattern, which is from around 1900. Or block quilting, as seen in this Amish-made 9-patch quilt from LaGrange County in northern Indiana. In applique, shapes are cut out and sewed onto a base material, whole cloth. In block quilting, each block is stitched to each other. Before we delve a little deeper into Amish quilt patterns, let's look at the structure of a quilt to make sure everyone understands that. There's a back, a filler or batting, and then there's a quilt top. The three layers are held together by the process of quilting, or stitching through the three layers. Some do this by hand, others use machines. Yes, some Amish have used treadle sewing machines for over 100 years. Whether by hand or by machine, all quilts are made the same way. The three layers are stitched together. Quilters will often turn the quilt over and look closely at the stitches to see first if it is machine quilted. If the stitches are too even, it might be quilted by machine. If hand-quilted, they may look to see how straight the stitches are and how many there are per inch. The closer, the better. For the general public, the top of the quilt is a showy part. But for many quilters, it's the handwork that catches their eyes. Now let's talk about the patterns in Amish quilts. Amish often made their quilts from the same material that they used to make their clothing, which were often dark and had no print. That's why they're often referred to themselves as plain people. They want to keep things plain, want to keep it simple, not draw attention to themselves. So many of the quilts play with the contrast between light and dark, rather than using some type of floral print material. Plain quilts will be the first that we look at. Plain quilts, like this one, were made from a whole cloth, one whole piece, with a contrasting color appliqued to the top, that is, applied to the top, stitched to the top. Note the solid, bold color, the same material as she might have made her own dress or her husband's jacket from. Whole cloths use a large piece of material, so those become very special quilts, very dynamic looking. Another early pattern common to Amish quilts are bar quilts, still using the bold, solid colors. A quilt is made up of several solid strips or bars, contrasting and making a unique pattern. Here's an early 20th century example, a variation of a Joseph's Many Colors quilt. An Amish-made bar quilt The many colors refers to the biblical story of Joseph's coat of many colors. But structurally, it's still a bar quilt. Amish quilts would go on to inspire several modernist art projects. In 1971, the Whitney Museum of American Art opened an exhibition called Abstract Design in American Quilts. If one compares the work of artists such as Joseph Ebers, the influence becomes apparent. The use of bars and large solid square blocks can be directly traced to the work of Amish and Mennonite quilters, whose work was starting to gain recognition at the time. While some curators and collectors appreciated the modernist aspect of these quilts, they often failed to foreground how these objects were also an expression of their makers, communities, and worldview. Here's a quilt pattern called Hole in the Barn Door, a name that reflects the world of Amish life. In this example, made by Rebecca Bontrager Kaufman of Middlebury in 1935, it is pieced with a traditional mistake in it. See the block sewn out of place in the top left corner? This is a common practice in the Amish community, where the quilter makes clear that nothing is perfect but God. As you can see, objects like quilts reflect the individual, cultural, and social identity of their makers. Amish quilters discovered that through the use of these bold colors, they could also play with the appearance of depth in their quilts. The garden maze, Jack in the pulpit, or railroad crossing patterns all use solid colors to create the visual illusion of three-dimensionality. Perhaps the best example of this is the variation of a block pattern to create a tumbling block quilt. Here's an Amish version of that pattern from the 1920s. Similarly, this Amish rail fence from around 1910 also uses this repetitive pattern to play with the eye in order to make it seem as if there's depth. Just as a side note, famed quilter Bernice Inyard, who also lives in Grant County in Northeastern Indiana, collected quilts and quilt tops from the region and fell in love with this 3D technique. She received national attention for her use of color and depth in her quilts. She took the traditional tumbling block pattern of the Amish who lived near her and made it her own, combining it with popular star patterns of quilts, as seen in this quilt she called Welcome to Star City. As you can see, Indiana has been a major contributor to the history of quilt making, both through the work of Marie Webster, but moreover through the aesthetics of quilters from the past and from the region. One group that influenced contemporary quilt making were Mennonite and Amish quilters. These women shared patterns and designs within their Mennonite communities. The patterns reflect the values, aesthetics, and techniques of that community. In addition, their quilts inspire artists and other quilters who adapt their aesthetics to make new work. In the next unit, we'll continue to talk about quilts, but in that lecture, we'll focus more explicitly on quilting groups and how quilts can be an expression of individual and group identity in diverse communities.